Let me ask you a question. Have you faced an issue where you were waiting for your batch apex to move from holding stage to the in progress stage? This happens because in Salesforce only 5 concurrent batches are allowed, and if you cross that limit, then your batch needs to wait for its turn. If you haven't faced such issues, then I would call you lucky. But sooner or later, you will face such issues as you invest more in batch apex. Now, what if I tell you that Salesforce has come up with a new feature which is called Query Cursors, and it has promising application to use as an alternative to the batch apex. In today's session, we will see how we can utilize Query Cursor to implement a batch. As well, we'll learn about more things on the Query Cursors. So without further delay, let's get started. So what is Query Cursor? Query Cursor is a pointer to a large set of data. Instead of loading all the data into the memory, Query Cursor gives you a pointer to a large set of data, and with the use of pointer, you can paginate through the data. Traditionally, when you make SOCL, then all the records get loaded into the memory. So for the performance reasons, Salesforce puts a cap on maximum number of records that you can query in a transaction, which is 50,000 records. However, in case of Query Cursor, the records are not loaded into the memory, so it can point to a very large set of data, which is 50 million of records. With Query Cursor, you can paginate through the data in forward and backward direction. Not only that, but you can jump through the data as well. Let's see the methods which are available to work with Query Cursor. There are three key elements that you need to know in order to work with Query Cursor. First, how to create the Query Cursor. In order to create the Query Cursor, you need to call a getCursor method on the database class, and you need to pass dynamic SOCL. That will return you the instance of database.cursor. Second, in order to fetch records, you need to call a fetch method on the instance of database.cursor. And the first parameter is the start position, and the second parameter is the number of records that you would like to fetch. And the third is the getNumRecords method available on the cursor. This will give you the number of records that this cursor is pointing to, which is nothing but the count of the records. Now, like any other thing in Salesforce, in order to avoid abuse, there are certain limitations which are put together on the query cursor. Let's go through that. So the first one is maximum number of records that you can fetch with the query cursor is 50 million, and maximum number of records that you can fetch in a day using query cursor is 100 million. Maximum records allowed per fetch is 2000, and maximum number of fetch calls per transaction is 10. With that logic, you would be able to fetch 20,000 records in a transaction. Then maximum number of query cursor that can be created per day is 10,000, and the life of query cursor is 2 days, which means if you create a query cursor today, you can still fetch the records tomorrow as well. With this knowledge, let's see how we can utilize Query Cursor and Queueable in order to simulate a batch Apex. In this example, we are going to process the contacts where there was an activity in the last 400 days. For that, we are implementing a simple Queueable using Queueable interface. Here, in the constructor of this Queueable, we are creating the instance of the database.cursor. We are storing it in the locator property. In order to create the instance, we are calling the method getCursor on the database. We are passing a dynamic SOCL, and after that, we are updating the position to 0. We are setting this position to 0 so that we will start fetching the records from the 0th position. In the execute method, we are calling fetch method to fetch first 200 records from the 0th position, and we are updating the position so that next time we will fetch next set of records. Post that, you can perform your logic on the number of records that you have retrieved, and after that, if you find that your position is less than the total number of records, then you can enqueue the same queueable instance. Note here we are just passing this instead of creating new query chunking queueable. This ensures that next time this constructor is not going to fire, and it's going to use the same instance where the locator and the position are stored. When next time Salesforce is going to execute the execute method, locator will not be null. It will still point to the old one that we created in the first place. And also we will have the position that we had updated in the previous execution. With that, you would be able to fetch next set of records, and that way we will perform the logic again and again on the chunks of the records till the time we don't reach the end of the records. So this is how we have implemented a batch Apex using query cursor and queueable. How cool is that? Now you might be wondering that can we use this as an alternative all the time to the batch Apex? Now let's compare the batch Apex and query cursor in order to answer that question. Traditional batch Apex comes with the monitoring support where you can just navigate to the standard Salesforce UI and monitor a batch Apex, where you can check how many number of records are being processed and how many number of records are completed and how many are remaining. However, in case of this custom simulated version of the batch Apex, you don't have such support. You can build your own, but then you would need to start logging that information into custom object. Then another thing, that with the traditional batch Apex, you get support like start and finish methods where you can plug some logic which you would like to fire at the beginning of the batch and something at the end of the batch Apex. That is not available in the implemented version, but yes, since it's a custom, you can build something of your own. It's not that difficult, but something I would like to call out. And another key point that I've found is batch Apex are way faster than the queueable version. A simple example where I tried to process 20k records took actually 39 seconds with batch Apex, whereas it took 4 minutes to complete with queueable version. There's a plus point to the batch up with the batch Apex simulated via query cursor and queueable, where you are not subjected to the 5 batch Apex concurrent limit. With this comparison, I would like to suggest that first you fully utilize the batch Apex, and if you start facing challenges with the batch Apex, then you can pivot your implementation towards the simulated version of the batch Apex. By keeping all these limitations in mind, the important one, it will be definitely slower than the batch Apex. Now let's see an interesting thing that I found about this query cursor. Query cursor in Apex might be a new feature, but this is not something really new for Salesforce. Salesforce has been using query cursor from a long time, at least in the APIs. You can see that when we make a query, a simple query can be select ID from contact. It returns you the first 2000 records, and for next set of records, it just gives you the next URL. And notice the content of this URL. Here, it just gives the ID and then dash with the offset. When you hit this URL, you will get the next set of records, and this ID is nothing but the query cursor. Here you can see that in action. When I create a query cursor in Apex, and if I debug that, if I print that information, that you will find that there is a query ID, and note the first 3 characters of this ID 0R8, and here also it's 0R8. That proves that that kind of like tells you that query cursor is not a new feature. It's just something which was there, but it was not exposed in Apex for us to use, and Salesforce has started exposing that. I hope you find it interesting. Let's see some of the what ifs while working with query cursor. What if the data is updated after creating query cursor? Let's take an example where you created a query cursor, and before you fetch the records were updated. Now, what would happen when you call the fetch method? Will it return the older version of the data or the latest version of the data? So the answer is it will return always the latest version of the data. It won't return the stale version. What if the data is deleted after creating the query cursor? Same principle. It will reflect the latest data. Since the data is deleted, it will not return the deleted records. Let's take an example. Let's say you have 100 records and You created a query cursor and you are fetching records in the chunks of 20. And let's assume that the 5 records are deleted, the first 5 records. When you call the fetch method for the first time, even though you pass 0 as the starting index and 20 as the size of or number of records that you would like to fetch, you will only get 15 records because the 5 records has been already deleted. The next, what if the cursor 2 days time has expired? Cursor comes with the 2 days expiry time, and if you try to call any method like fetch or get num records on the cursor which has been expired, then you will get an exception. With that, I would like to leave some of the recommendations while working with query cursor. We have seen how we can utilize query cursor and queueable to simulate a batch of X. Though it has a great advantage where you are not subjected to the 5 batch effects limit, but I would like to recommend to make use of batch effects in the first place. And when you start experiencing some of the challenges with the limitations around batch effects, that will be a good point to turn towards the query cursor and queueable as an alternative. Another place where you can simplify the implementation is pagination. Try to use query cursor whenever there is a need of the pagination, but at the same time, keep that in mind that there is a limitation on the number of cursors that you can create per day, which is 10K. And when I say pagination, that does not mean the pagination only on the client side. Sometimes the pagination could be on the API layer also. Let's say you have implemented a custom API and your client wants to paginate through the data. You can make use of query cursor to simplify the implementation. That's all to the query cursor. I hope you learned something new, and thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one. Thank you.